Hello everyone and welcome to the video for chapter 4 for our class. As always, this video is meant to be a supplement, not a replacement for your reading, so please make sure to go in and do that full reading. I just want to take this time to explain a couple of key concepts that you're going to run into within the chapter and within the discussion boards, just to kind of make this a little bit easier for you to manage. So the main thing I want to draw your attention to from the book is the idea of the Elizabethan Poor Laws of 1601. I want to draw special attention to this because this existence of the Poor Laws are really a shift, a keystone shift in how social welfare was thought of and carried out in a civil manner that still is affecting modern society and our current response to social welfare. So in real brief summary, if you go back and read the text, you're going to see that in early history, social welfare was carried out by small units, generally your family or small communities. So if you were a person in need, then you really relied on your family or your small community to take care of you. Okay, so and obviously in that system, people are always going to be left behind, right? They're just because it's a small community, there is no ownership that says like we have to take care of this person who is struggling. But that is the primary system that was responsible for taking care of those who are in need. And then in Europe came feudalism. So feudalism arose in Europe primarily because there was a need for ongoing protection from the state. And so feudalism kind of came into being and created serfdoms. And the requirement of social welfare and care fell onto the liege lords. So I want to read just a real brief snippet from the book that kind of talks about this, because it's going to roll us into one of the ideas from the discussion board that I want to talk about as well. So within the text on page 89, it says that feudalism tied landhold with military service, and there was an embeddedness in the relationships among serfs, lords, and sovereigns. Non-free peasants owed their lives and worked for the Lord, and he owed them protection and good management of the community so that in hard times they might survive. Lords had land, power, a stable workforce, the right to military conscription for their own battles and those of their sovereigns, and taxing power without redress. In time, the care of serfs by liege lords became a kind of trust, a noblesse oblige, or obligation of honor, and in theory were all provided for. However, the lord's right took precedent over every right, need, facet of life, or desire of the serfs. So you're going to see that concept pop up here in a minute as well. We're going to talk about noblesse oblige a little bit further as it shows up in your discussion board. Before I do that, I do want to also mention about the Elizabethan Poor Laws is that when that shift occurred, it's because in the late 1500s, there was starvation, there were a great number of countrymen who were out of work. The book states anywhere between a quarter to a third of those able-bodied individuals were out of work, and there was extreme poverty. And so that is when the country as a whole stepped up and said that we need to have a civil response for social welfare. And so that kind of triggered the response, and instead of the care falling to that of the liege lords, it now fell to the state to say we are going to put policies in place to help those who are suffering. Okay, now you're going to see through the text that all sounds good and great, but that doesn't mean that things were all sunny. Okay, we're talking about a shift in momentum and thinking, but that doesn't mean that all things were good and well. One of the things I want you to focus on within the book are how they talk about the impotent poor, how they treated dependent children, and the able-bodied poor as well. especially the area on dependent children, because that is a term that still exists today, but it had a very kind of different meaning, and the response from the state was very, very different for dependent children at this time. Okay, so so please, please, please make sure to go in and read that. I just want to draw your attention to it. So one of the concepts I just mentioned real briefly was the idea of noblesse oblige, and you're going to see this pop up in your discussion board, requesting you to kind of dive in and think about this term a little bit more fully. And I want to address this a little bit, because I think there are conflicting understandings as to what this means. And I want to help draw some connections to how it existed kind of historically, and then how people are still kind of latching on to that idea in modern times. So one of the key things I want to focus on is that noblesse oblige creates an opportunity for oppression and segregation. So in theory, noblesse oblige could be a wonderful concept of philanthropy, in that the well-off are encouraged to help those who are less fortunate, right? If those who are under you are doing well, then in theory you're doing well too, and the system as a whole is healthier. And so if you are in a position of power, you are to help those in need. So in theory, that part sounds good, that if you are among the haves, that you should help the have-nots, okay? And that idea is tied to the feudalism within the book, okay? Now, what's important here is that we keep in mind that the concept itself only stretches so far as the one in power allows it to. And remember, what the book said is that it also only goes so far as what the power holders' needs allow it. So if your need is in conflict with mine and I'm the one with power, then I'm always going to put myself first. So there creates this opportunity for oppression. It's also important to remember that within feudalism, men and women under their lord were forced to kind of bend to his will, and that often meant receiving extreme treatment. So I want to kind of modernize this idea of noblesse oblige and how it exists in modern times. So let's kind of just start by summarizing what that concept means again. So in essence, you could think of noblesse oblige and the thought process that follows as saying, I have money and power, therefore I have rights. With rights come duties, and duties corroborate my rights. Okay, so this becomes kind of a cyclical thinking and a cyclical logic. So the first part is the part that everyone latches onto that sounds good. That sounds like philanthropy. I have money, and so I'm going to assist those who are below me. But then they also kind of start to pat themselves in the back. Well, I have money and power, and so I could do with it as I wish. And so that's where we kind of get into trouble. So think about this, for example, in modern times. So let's think of a modern fiscally conservative ideology, okay? So in fiscal conservatism, one of the things that is kind of like a keystone concept is the reduction of big government, okay? So they believe that if you reduce big government, you put the money back in the hands of the people that earn that money. So, reduce taxation, give the money back to those who were putting in the hours. And then once they have that money, then they can have more flexibility in how it is spent, right? So if I worked really hard and I earned all this money, and I was able to get more money back to my pocket that wasn't going to the government, if I felt really strongly about a particular subject or a particular issue, then I could support that issue myself, as opposed to like the government do that for me. Okay, so like in theory, that kind of makes sense. But we enter into this kind of slippery slope kind of moral idea Again, I have money and power, so I'll take care of those less fortunate. However, you can also be said, I have earned my money and power. I have a right to my money and power. I have a duty to protect those less fortunate, but my duty validates my right to the money. And at the end of the day, it is my right to choose to do with my money as I see fit. So, when you think about that, you think about giving the money back to those who earned it and saying, we trust that you're going to do what's best with that money, then you start to understand that there are going to be whole sections of the community, whole populations, entire demographics, whole geographical areas, for example, that are being overlooked. They're When you put the power back into the individual, sometimes the larger picture gets overlooked as well. So so think about that. Think about the idea of noblesse oblige, how that existed in the time of feudalism, but also how those ideas continue to trickle in and show their face in modern times as well. So so think about that. The other thing that I want you to think about is, well, not really to think about as much as I want to define, because every semester folks get really confused about the aspect of the discussion board that talks about de facto labor policies. So let me actually just pull that part of the discussion board up and read it to you. So in the discussion board, it talks about, or it asks, are modern social welfare programs for the poor a form of de facto labor policy? So really where the confusion comes from is the de facto part. So there are de facto is closely tied to this other term called de jure, and de jure is means basically in law or legally, and de facto kind of by definition means that something exists in reality, but that there is no law to back it. So de facto labor policy, when you kind of think about what that means, is that there is a labor policy that is in existence that doesn't actually exist on the books, doesn't exist in law, but in practice it does. So so that might help as you're approaching it. That idea, that concept might be a little foreign though. So so let me kind of like bring that home a little bit for you to kind of help understand a bit more. To do that, I'm going to use the idea of like de facto segregation. That might be a little bit easier to wrap your mind around as you're thinking about de facto labor policy. So de facto segregation, so this would be segregation that exists not in law but in practice. So let's first kind of back up a second and look at de jure segregation. So this is segregation that occurred in law. So if we jump back a little bit, and honestly, when I say a little bit, that's very true. It wasn't that long ago when the Jim Crow laws existed in our country, and it was illegal to oppress individuals and to segregate individuals by law. Okay, so that is de jure segregation. But now there is no de jure segregation, but that does not mean that there is not de facto segregation, and that that there is an obvious divisiveness in the country that still exists, even though it's not as black and white in on paper, right? So one concept of or one version of this would be de facto segregation in the school system. Okay, so there is this idea of white flight. So if you are in an urban kind of environment, historically, white individuals tend to kind of leave the center of cities and head to the suburbs, and then in the midst of the cities are minority individuals, especially if you look at larger cities. Individuals end up in poorer neighborhoods, less resources, and then you also have school systems in that area, right? So so those school systems are funded by property taxes and things like that. And so when you have an individual who is kind of in the inner city and they are um, going to a school that is funded by the property taxes of that poor area in which they live, and that area is primarily populated by minorities, and then you look at a school system in the suburbs that is primarily populated by individuals who are white and Caucasian that have left the inner city, and they kind of took that money with them, and they're funding their school system with with larger property taxes and those kinds of things. Then you are in fact kind of creating the scene for de facto segregation in the education world, even though that's different than maybe what happened in de jure segregation prior to Brown v. Board of Education. It still exists, right? So de facto, not in law, but in practice, still exists. So think about that when you're thinking about labor policy and social welfare programs. When you answer your discussion board question, even though something is not in law, is there a labor policy that is being formed just in the practice of how that's carried out? So think about that. And then the last thing is we're also diving back into the concept of the worthy versus the unworthy poor. You're going to see that pop up in the Elizabethan poor laws again. We talked about this in the previous chapters. And it's a concept you're going to keep seeing over and over again. We talked about a little bit with the Protestant work ethic. And this, again, is that idea that in social welfare, there are those who are worthy of receiving assistance and those who are not worthy. And the big question that I pose to each of you is to think about where you stand in terms of your approach to those who are in need. So do you fall on the side of believing that there is a worthy versus unworthy? And if so, if you think that there are worthy poor, do they have to prove their worth through something like working in order to receive social welfare, right? That is an idea that is posed in various programs. Or do you fall on the side of thinking that individuals all kind of innately deserve to receive assistance regardless? Okay, so let me give an example that of thinking about how individuals are innately deserving of social welfare as opposed to having to prove their worth, and also thinking about how that can still benefit individuals, right? So previously, I used to work for a permanent supportive housing program here in Evansville called Vision 1505. And this is a program for formerly homeless families. Permanent supportive housing kind of initially came about for single individuals. And the idea of permanent supportive housing is that this is housing that is income-based. And if you have no money, then you pay no rent. So the lowest your rent can be is $0. But alongside the permanent supportive housing, it's not just the existence of housing itself, but there is also this piece where a case manager is tied to the permanent supportive housing program or project to help provide ongoing services. And the individuals who are coming into that program are considered chronically homeless. So that is a criteria to get in to the program or to get into that housing. And so the reason that permanent supportive housing came into existence is that people said that everyone deserves the right to housing. This is not something that you should have to earn. But the way that our system is currently set up, it's kind of exists on a what they call a continuum of care. And so so it harkens back to all these ideas that we're talking about, in that when you are homeless, you first enter a homeless shelter. If you do well in the homeless shelter, then we can look at trying to get you into something like transitional housing. If you do well in transitional housing, then maybe we can get you into permanent housing. And so we make individuals kind of prove themselves along the way so that they can eventually get into permanent housing. Permanent supportive housing says you don't have to prove yourself. We're going to give you housing first, and then we're going to work on all the other stuff, right? So instead of saying like you need to work on your mental health and your addiction and then get a house, we're going to say we're going to give you housing, and then we're going to wrap you up with support and address these other things, right? Goes back to that idea of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We got to make sure that your basic need of housing is met before some of those higher functioning concepts like getting addiction under control are addressed. Okay, and so this is kind of that flip side, is that everyone is worthy, right? It doesn't matter like what your background is. It doesn't matter. You don't have to prove yourself. We believe that all individuals deserve housing as a kind of a fundamental right. So so one of the ways to sell that to stakeholders is to think about like the societal impact as well, right? So other than kind of the altruism of just doing well and helping someone out, it's also a cost saver to those stakeholders as well. So you have a cost to live on the streets, right? It costs money to run a homeless shelter. It costs money anytime an individual without primary care goes into an emergency room, for example, and receives emergent care instead of going to a doctor and addressing things before they become emergencies, right? If an individual is sleeping on the streets and end up in jail, right, we're paying for that individual to be in jail. And so all the previous studies have shown that it costs about $20,000 a year in public funds to keep an individual homeless and on the streets, which is kind of crazy when you stop and think about how much it actually costs. Every time you see someone who's sleeping on a sidewalk, it costs us about $20,000 a year as a society to leave them on the sidewalk. Whereas permanent supportive housing, once we get them into housing, even when you factor in the cost of housing, the rent, the case management, because there is going to be a shift to working on stuff that's more preventative and less emergent, it costs somewhere between like $10,000 and $13,000 a year in public funds to keep an individual in housing. Then it is actually cheaper than keeping them on the streets, right? So we have to kind of think outside the box a little bit as we're approaching these ideas, and just think about, why we are so attached to these old ideas of worthy versus unworthy. And a lot of it comes from the fact that we get attached to our money, we get attached to our resources, we fight and work hard for that. And so then we feel an ownership over our money, and then we get really protective over where that goes. And so and we don't stop to think about some of those impacts of how our money could be used, if there's a way to use our money more efficiently, and if we can assist a greater number of people in the process. So I know this video got a little bit longer than probably what I intended it to, so I do apologize for that, but I thought these ideas were important for us to talk about. I'll try to keep my future videos a little bit shorter for you, but I thank you for tuning into this. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I appreciate you all so much. Thanks.